Recording in progress.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today it's a pleasure for me to introduce you Felix Offenberger. Felix did the master and PhD in mathematics in combinatorial topology at the University of Stuttgart in 2011. Then he worked as a postdoctoral researcher in the field of mathematical and computational neuroscience at the Max Planck Institute for Mathematics in the Science in Leipzig with Jürgen Host group. Then in the Ernest Straumann Institute for Neuroscience and the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Study for several years with Hermann Kunz and Wolf Singer. His research topics at that time were based on modeling of self-organization in balanced state networks through synaptic plasticity, neural data analysis with Ising model, modeling dendritic geometries, information theory-based methods, and more. In 2017, he became Chief Technical Officer at the San Francisco-based startup to work in augmented reality for live sport, a position he still holds. Yet, he still is interested in basic research and returned to the Singer's group at the Ernest Straumann Institute in 2020, and his research interest there shifted to neuroscience-inspired machine learning, studying brain-inspired model of neural activity with application to machine learning, and in particular, recurrent oscillatory network that he's going to talk about today. In 2022, he started advising the Earth Species Project, a non-profit organization that studies animal communication using machine learning-based method. So welcome, Felix, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Claudio. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and having the opportunity to present to you our latest work. This is joined with Pedro Carvalho, Igor Dubinin, and I'm a postdoc in the group of Wolf Singer in Frankfurt. The Ernst Straumann Institute is a fully privately funded Max Planck Institute and will soon actually turn into a full Max Planck Institute. And so what I'm going to present to you here today is kind of work that evolved over the last years that went through several cycles. I actually presented an earlier version of this some 2 years ago already here in a smaller circle. So the starting points for us were, well, Wolf Singer basically dedicated his life to studying oscillations in neural systems from the physiological point of view. And so we came together when we met and we said, well, you know, there's all these ongoing discussions whether those oscillations have a functional relevance. And this is highly debated still to this day in the neuroscience community. And I don't have to, you're a physicist, I don't have to tell you that everything essentially is, you know, oscillating in the universe from the macro to the micro scale, from, you know, stars even over planetary, then other systems, predator-prey population, protein interactions, down to the level of strings. And this is why you shouldn't, it shouldn't wonder you that also in neuroscience, right, the neural systems are oscillating. So we also have some phenomena like bursting, etc. But oscillations naturally emerge from excitatory inhibitory systems, and it's basically almost impossible to not have them. So I've done studying in of spiking networks myself, balanced state networks, and synaptic plasticity in the past. And we tried to get the network, you know, to the asynchronous irregular state of firing. And this is super hard, especially if you're dealing with finite size networks. You always have a kind of remainder of oscillations, even if you very tightly tune it. So the question is then, well, can you use these oscillations? Are they just, so to say, an epiphenomenon, or are they exploited for computation? So certainly in physics, there have been many over the last decades, of course, from Ising machines to other spintronic applications of using oscillator networks for doing computations. so we were interested, okay, so, it certainly can be done. Well, but in neuroscience, relatively little was known. And so this is basically, I would say, kind of a coincides a bit with a new field that is being proclaimed, which is neuro AI, which is really the merging of neuroscience and machine learning research, because clearly the current machine learning approaches are maximally distantly inspired, okay, by brain architectures, because biological intelligence is analog, recurrent, the signals are time series, we're dealing with oscillations and waves. The learning rules are believed to be local and online, no global knowledge, Hebbian learning. It's fast, usually one shot. It's incremental, but not facing this catastrophic forgetting, as we see in many of the digital models or the machine learning models. It's data efficient, sample size 1, and it's energy efficient. So the brain, German word for this is Gehirn, I don't know why it sneaked in there. The brain uses around 30 watts of energy consumed in the form of glucose and does all these amazing things that it does. On the other hand, we have machine learning, artificial intelligence, which to these days is digital, feed forward, has no time, no oscillations, supervised training, offline, global with backpropagation, slow learning, data intensive, and insanely energy hungry. So this is almost like this is the fly, and it's probably acting more intelligently than a big supercomputer because it has probably consciousness. So our goal is, or with this project also, was to bring the neuroscience back into machine learning, because that kind of got lost over the decades. And we're not the only ones. There's more people now thinking that. And if you look at models like, ChatGPT and all these, the current machine learning revolution that we're seeing and claims on artificial general intelligence and reasoning abilities of those models, they consume insane amounts of energy and still are not able to surpass simple intelligence like children. That aren't, haven't been trained or anything, are acting more intelligently than those models. And the model, look, they're trying to hire, the goal is now to build nuclear reactors that power the data centers. So since nature can't do that, it has to have found a different solution. And so I also think that the current models that we see, like the transformers and the linear state space models, they're basically, I see them as a first order Taylor approximation of recurrent dynamics. So and what we see there actually is that we can expect much, much more, and we see that in biological systems if we can harness those. The problem with recurrent networks is they are hard to train with backpropagation. We have all these problems, exploding and vanishing gradients, and this is why people focused on the feed forward, because they're easy to train with backpropagation. So basically what we currently see is that's generated by a feed-forward network. So this shows the transformer here as the brainchild of NVIDIA as the mother and backpropagation as the father. And what those models pretend actually is that time doesn't exist. And the model tries to kind of fill in the text here. Time does not exist, encoder layers exist. So they do not use the mathematically, so to say, infinite, if you believe in continuous time, state space. And they need to emulate that using labeled line codes in a feed-forward fashion. That's what you buy with the transformer. And what the transformer does is it makes the computational graph shallow. That's what backpropagation likes. So he pleases the father. And at the same time, it does so by making all, at the same time, by doing a parallel inferencing over all time steps in parallel, and then mixing through what's called attention, right, in a later step. You pay for this, which is quadratic compute cost and quadratic memory cost, and that quadratic energy expenditure. But the model likes that because she has a lot of parallel computing units that can be utilized. So this basically the three, so to say, pillars. So I would say that's why the transformer is the currently that architecture, because that ideally suits the two parents' needs. So in order to overcome this, I think we need to change three things. We need to change the models to be recurrent. We need to change the hardware basis to be more suited for this recurrent, so to say. And also another thing is like you have to unroll the loops when you simulate them on digital hardware. It's slow. And then we also need to change the way training is done by replacing backpropagation with locally active, biologically inspired rules. So that brings me finally to the questions that we had here for the problems. So we said, okay, are the oscillations unavoidable? They are unavoidable, definitely, but are they also useful? So what we did is actually go in the middle, and there's a lot of models that are neuroscientific models that very precisely recreate certain dynamics that we know from physiological experiments and so on, but they usually don't process any data. They're being fed with Poisson spike trains, essentially noise. And what do you expect the model to do? You know, when it's given noise in, noise out somehow. So we said, okay, let's go into a setting where we take the biological realism from inspired by neuroscience. But at the same time, we take, and that's the other class of models that we see a lot these days, machine learning models, where people don't give a damn about any biological realism. And the only thing they look for is task performance. So we said, let's marry those two things and let's do something which is biologically more plausible, but at the same time take task performance on a given number of benchmarks as a proxy for functional relevance of some of those things that those networks have. And so basically we can quantify this. So we simulated recurrent networks with biologically inspired features. Most importantly, oscillatory units, heterogeneity, coupling delays, and modularity. So the approach was a bit to overcome this epistemic hurdle, namely that in a neural system, everything oscillates. It's, as I said earlier, you know, it's impossible to get rid of those. If you kill the oscillations, you kill the system. You have nothing left. So, but these are usually emergent phenomena on the network level. So our solution that we decided to take is that we want to enforce oscillatory activity in each network node, and this acts as an inductive bias in the networks. So a good example here is this makes the, so to say, enforcing that makes the extended dynamical primitives that you have through oscillator dynamics, such as resonance and frequency-dependent gain modulation, available to, because we train the network still with backpropagation, to the backpropagation algorithm. So basically, and this is not the case if we would not enforce the oscillatory activity, if they were emergent, like in, you know, networks of leaky integrators. And now by itself, backpropagation would not, if I have a you know, network that can oscillate, but in practice, you know, not in a structured way, backpropagation would just not find those solutions. By enforcing those extended dynamical primitives to be always active, to always have a phase in a node, to always have oscillations, we basically make this different by having this, putting this inductive bias into the network. We make this accessible to backpropagation. And so a good example here would be, if you want to compare this to studying convolutional networks in the feed-forward domain, while you could make an MLP network, just multi-layer perceptrons, and train them with images, and in theory, they could develop a convolutional structure. In practice, they never do. And this is exactly the simplicity bias, you know, of backpropagation gets stuck in the next local minimum, and the parameter space is just too huge. So restricting the systems here to have a convolutional structure made all the difference. And we claim that putting in the dynamical prior of having oscillatory dynamics in recurrent networks also makes all the difference here, assuming this backpropagation trace training. So instead of, so to say, looking for the needle in the haystack, we built a haystack of needles. But this, by the way, it was very hard to get the system to generate something. This is done with Gen AI to get, because it's just so outside of its training data, a stack of needles. It would refuse to, you know, it took me like a couple of tries. So basically, I already told you, we have recurrent networks. We give them time series stimuli. And in contrast to machine learning, where some of similar models have been studied in the last years, so they also picked up on this, we care about the dynamics. and the principles that those dynamics enable. So we don't just care for table 1 that shows our model is better than the previous ones by 0.1% on MNIST or something like that, classification accuracy. No, we care about the principles that are behind this. So, but what we take, this is what we take from neuroscience, but for machine learning, we take this approach of measuring task performance. So we still want to use that as a proxy for functional relevance, and we do gradient-based training. So basically what we do, and many of the things that I show you here now, is that we take these MNIST digits, we solve this well-known hello world problem, so to say, of machine learning. So these are 28 by 28 pixel digits. We serially scan those pixel values, just intensity values, turn this into a time series of 784 time steps, and then we feed those sequentially into the network, and that the dynamics evolve over 784 time steps, and then we do a linear readout, and we ask the network to solve that classification problem, which digit did you see? And that is trained with a cross-entropy loss, so all very standard. Why did we choose now to have oscillating units? This is one of the motivating works. This came out of the EZ. A group found out that the spontaneous variability in the Ganymed dynamics are well described in V1, are well described by a damped harmonic oscillator driven by noise. So I would not say driven by noise, I would say driven by unobserved signals. Okay, so this was a big motivator where we said, okay, that might be a good basic unit. At the same time, so to say, if you think about oscillatory activity, if you apply basically Occam's razor, you get, this is the quintessential reduction, is the damped harmonic oscillator. Again, I don't want to bore you. You know the description, it has a dampening natural frequency. Basically, the solutions are combining two of the most fundamental principles of the universe, which is exponential decay and sinusoidal oscillations, right? When you convolve them, that's what you get, the solutions. And they're easily controllable, those dynamics. We have two control parameters that are very independently, and we know how the relaxation dynamics look very well. And you actually, with this model, you capture also key characteristics of the Wilson-Cohen model, which is a population model that models the activity of an EI-coupled population. So this is here. So in that sense, each node in our networks does not represent a single neuron, but it's a mesoscale model which represents some abstract activity that is happening in some neural population, which contains excitatory and inhibitory units. If you want, think about one node in our network as a cortical column or as a microcircuit, okay? So a thing that can oscillate. In the extreme case, one node, think about certain models in systems in insects, they also have oscillating neurons. So in that sense, it could also represent a neuron. It really, there's a certain interpretation that you can make here. And then the amplitude maybe is a firing rate, or it could be a form of an LFP signal, or even the amount of synchrony that you find in a population. So in that sense, this Horn model, so the harmonic oscillator recurrent RNN, is kind of a network of network approach. It's a mesoscale model to modeling brain activity. And as I said, we capture the essence of the oscillations in Wilson-Cohen, for example, models. And now let's think about this from the signal of signal processing. Well, if any input that you give to a damped harmonic oscillator gets turned into a harmonic oscillation, a standing wave in that one point. So you give it a delta pulse, harmonic oscillation. You get it 2 delta pulses, well, it still stays there. And now, depending on how complex the forcing is, some interesting things can happen. And you can go through amplitude and phase. For example, think about this case here. That's one DHO that receives two delta pulses. One is high-low, and the other one low-high. If you do this and feed this to a leaky integrator, you immediately, when you feed the second thing, basically lose the information on a stimulus sequence. But in an oscillator, it can code this in the phase, and it's available to decode. You will know. So you have a higher, so to say, coding space. Also, and you also all know this, you have nonlinear amplitude modulation based on frequency. That's a gain curve here. So, and this is important. So it tapers off, so to say, to 1 as the input frequency goes to 0, and it tapers off to 0 as the input frequency goes to infinity. And that's the natural, frequency of the oscillator here. And now what this means, though, is interesting when you think about it in signal processing. Taken to the Fourier domain, it's just a box filter, right? But with nonlinear effects. So in a certain, you can be approximated by the box filter. It doesn't show resonance. But when you now, for example, give a single node, a single DHO node, this signal here, the orange one, which is low frequency irregular signal, this is what you get. The top here shows the resulting amplitude from the oscillator. Now I give the same signal corrupted with additive white Gaussian noise. High frequency, you land here. So these things naturally act as noise removers in each single node. And that actually brings us to the actual network. So what we do is we take just the usual damped harmonic oscillator ODE, and this is the external part, this is the input. And we discretize this equation in time. This is also sometimes known as a neural ODE approach. So basically and then the network nodes, when we make discrete time, they can perform Euler integrations. You need an implicit Euler because this is a stiff equation here. One part is stiff. So you do an Euler integration of this of these relaxation dynamics, and this is the external forcing. And the external forcing here, this is a nonlinearity, just to prevent runaway dynamics. Alpha is an excitability factor, and this is the external current that comes from both external and recurrent connections inside the network. And then we additionally added feedback connections. So there's feedback connections from the node to itself on the amplitude and on the derivative. And this feedback connection actually, so to say, and then they are additively coupled on their derivatives. Okay, that's motivated by the balanced state. So the node actually does not send to its neighbors its amplitude, but its change of the amplitude. It's basically signaling the rate of change. And that is motivated by the balanced state, where in cortical neurons or circuits, it has been shown many times that they seem to operate at a balanced state where in the mean, the excitatory and inhibitory currents cancel. And the nodal activity or the cell activities, neuron activities, neuron spiking is driven by fluctuations of those excitatory and inhibitory. And that actually allows the system to be to beat the long time scales of the slow units they're composed of. So basically, motivated by this, we couple here on the derivatives and can actually show it works better than a coupling on the amplitudes, which is another choice. And then, as I said, I'm going to speed this up a bit here. So we take this. This is the network equation here. Then we split it as usual into a family of first order equations. We discretize time, and these are then the update equations. So each node has two state variables, where one is basically hidden. It's internal to the node that does not get communicated to the neighbors. And then the one, namely the derivative here, that is kind of propagated to the neighbors. And now I told you all this. Then let's have a look at a couple of dynamics. So those networks do. Here, they're stimulated with m-nist digits. Now we have different networks here. One is homogeneous in the left column. This is all nodes have the same natural frequency and the same damping. Okay, that is an untrained network, means weak random coupling. And this is that's on the top row, and the bottom row is a trained network, meaning these networks have been trained with backpropagation to classify m-nist digits. Okay, so you see here homogeneous network. Well, there's clearly some coupling. You see some interesting temporal variations here, but the network is clearly highly synchronized because those nodes have no noise. They're all starting at the same point and they're driven by the same input. Yeah? Still, the network kind of learns to solve the task, where we'll talk about that in a second. Now here, the interesting case, though, is the heterogeneous case. Because in natural systems are highly heterogeneous, and many times you hear it from neuroscientists, hey, this heterogeneity is just there because of nature's imprecision. But we say here, no. We think that this heterogeneity has a strong functional meaning. And you see this here, now there's a heterogeneous network in a very weak coupling regime. You see it here, and then here you see it trained. And those things, if you look at them, you probably wouldn't immediately think of damped harmonic oscillators when you look at those time series. So these are the dynamics that they produce. I want to skip those. So those feedback connections actually yield to a much different state space than just a simple DHO. So when we have a feedback on the derivative and it's positive, the node can undergo a Hopf bifurcation and actually display sustained oscillations and basically overcome its damping and be like a harmonic oscillator. And the amplitude feedback can lead to a splitting here, pitchfork bifurcation, and then we get two stable attractors. And that actually enables, we have a whole extra unpublished work on this, very interesting properties even of single nodes, namely they can resonate at fractional harmonics of their natural frequency by making tours. When you have this case here, they're actually going in like this pattern around their stable attractors. And so it has very interesting implications for coding. And you can say, well, that's fine, man. But networks, every network oscillates, and oscillations are just the exhaust of the engine. That's what many neuroscientists still say. And so here we show this now that we basically assess the functional relevance, and we say that only this reduction allowed us to find this. Yeah. So we look at different variants: homogeneous networks, heterogeneous networks, delay coupled, and modular, where we take several. And this is what we find. Finally, I want to show you some results. Actually, test accuracy on MNIST digit classification as a function of training steps for the different models. Here you see these are relatively small models, by the way. These have 2,500 trainable parameters. They're tiny for machine learning. The machine learning people don't even talk about this. They start with a couple of 100,000 parameters. Below that, they don't even talk. Okay, this thing for them, and when I show this to machine learning people, they're like, no, you did something wrong. LSTM can never be so bad. Like, yes, it is when you give them not enough parameters. So here, that's the green line, LSTM. After 100 training epochs, it finally manages to get up there. That's funnily, this is a regular Elman RNN, regular, nothing special. Then this is GRU. GRU clearly catches up here and has less parameters because it has more cells, because it's simpler. This is a leaky integrator. We have also leaky integrator network. This is doing pretty well. And we have a paper on this, why this is the case. This is because of gradient stability, because basically those discretization procedure that I showed you of the ODE basically constructs residual connections in time that stabilize gradient flows. But we have, I will show you a reference, we have done a detailed analysis of this. And these are the oscillator networks. And this note here, the logarithmic scale. So those things start converging after like 10 gradient updates. So they have converged. This dashed line shows one epoch. This is the first time they saw the entirety of the training data set. So they're basically at 80–90% of their final solution. And one claim that I'm making, as you make those networks larger and more heterogeneous, you can approach the one-shot learning regime with those networks. And here is the parameter efficiency. So that's also on log scale, the number of trainable parameters with the maximally attained test accuracy on MNIST. These are the oscillator networks. Blue is homogeneous, orange is heterogeneous.
When it's one up, means that the 10 digits already have been seen by the network?
No, the training data set, this is a batch size of 128. So they see 128 examples. I think it was on every training step, on every gradient update step. And the whole data set is 50,000 training digits. So this is the first time they saw all 50,000. And so here you see that, and I can also give you an example. So here we actually see that the homogeneous network is slightly better than the heterogeneous one. This is just because the task is so simple. MNIST is such a simple task. I will show you some other examples here where we see in reality, actually, when the stimuli don't have these very easy properties, the heterogeneous ones are much better. Another example here. So here I'm training the networks. We're training them to do speaker-independent spoken digit classification. So basically, we have 1 second recordings, a lot of different, done with like webcams. It's a data set from Google. It's terrible quality. Some of them don't even contain anything. You have background noise. You have dogs in the background, animals. Anyways, so and we trained the networks and the data that those networks got was the raw sound pressure level values from the wave file. No pre-processing, no Fourier transform, no MFCC, nothing. So these receive high dimensional, long time series, and we train them again, and we force the network to solve this almost impossible task, say, produce an amplitude configuration at the last time step that allows us to tell what digit was said, speaker independent way. And these are all, whatever. And look at the number of trainable parameters, 250,000 parameters for LSTM, GRU, and so on. They never depart really from chance level. This is chance level, right? 10%. These are our these are the homogeneous networks. Well, they kind of get to 30%. And now here you see, this is the power of heterogeneity, because you have very complex spectra here, and the units are actually, and you get here to close to 70% classification accuracy without any Fourier transforms, anything. We also tested on some long-range arena tasks, which is, by the way, used for transformers to measure. And this is one particular thing here I wanted to point out is this is actually these are serialized Cypher 10 images, grayscale. The best transformer models make like 44 points in, so to say, mean accuracy. And then I took one of our models. They have millions of parameters. I took one of our models, 18,000 parameters. Didn't really train even didn't even do a parameter optimization of the parameters. 10 training epochs, trained for a couple of minutes, really. I take the parameters, just the ones that work well for MNIST, and we end up at 47%. So clearly, I'm not saying that all of the tasks we beat them or anything, but there are certainly some tasks that they can do well. Why does it work so well? So the units code for features, not just by means of changing converging weights. That's the only thing you can do in feed-forward architectures, labeled line codes, but also by means of resonance. For MNIST, there's a correspondence between the geometrical properties and the spectral properties of the signal. The contours of different slopes correspond to signals with power in different frequency bands. Here, a straight vertical line, I'm going to show you, is you have here this MNIST, right? So it's 28 by 28 pixels. And say I have a straight vertical line like this, 1 pixel wide. Now, if I serialize this, I collect all the pixels here in the scanline fashion. When I serialize this, what do I get? A delta comb with a period of 28, right? So what's the corresponding frequency? Is 2 pi over 28. What do I do? What do I do when I do this with a 45-degree angle of like that? I get a period of 29. So I get frequency of 2 pi over 29. What is this? This is a period of 27, right? So there's a correspondence. So those networks code in frequency space. And what they can do, if I have an oscillator with this natural or resonance frequency precisely, then those units start coding by resonance. They become feature detectors, right? This unit will really go in resonance when it sees a vertical line. There's other ones, and I can get all the angles. And so this is a new principle. And they turn those things into oscillations and wave patterns that, go through the network. Yeah, all the inputs are turned into this format. It's like a universal format of oscillations and waves. They can use superposition, etc., even for non-oscillating inputs. And this is what I wanted to show you. Like, this is a regular MNIST. This is the power spectrum, mean power spectrum for like mean invariance, or for some like 1,000 samples or 100 or something like that. And you see it's so simple. It's dominated by the fundamental frequency. This is 2 pi over 28 here. And that just means that all the information is here because it is locally geometric, right? And this is why for this simple, the homogeneous networks that I place in here, they are hard to beat. But now when we shuffle this, which we did also, we tested, where we basically make a flat spectrum. Now, wherever I sit with my homogeneous network, it will get roughly the same amount of information, and it will not be so good, okay? But now, when I take heterogeneous networks where I place the nodes everywhere on the spectrum, it gets almost as well as in the case. So we call these things, these gain curves, intrinsic receptive fields. So they have damping, natural frequency. And there's a kind of uncertainty principle. The unit can either have a high gain factor and then only represent a very narrow frequency band, or it can wider frequency band, yeah, do feature detection in a wider band, but then has lower gain factor. And so these self-connection terms, I don't have time to talk about this now, but they allow the units to shift their receptive fields. And so the units learn to cover the frequency space. That's an untrained network, and that's a trained network. And you see, you get certain nodes that move here to the right. So they code to the right means they code more for those angles. And if they move to the left here, to lower frequencies, that means the slant is a bit like that. And the units, and we also trained networks only on those contours. And when we train them on the contours, we notice, oh, they develop representations that are perfectly suited to classify MNIST also, or even something more complicated. So and this is exactly what happens in the visual system, we think. We have done a whole work. I don't have time for this, unfortunately, but we looked into the dynamical systems analysis on such types of networks. This was done by Igor, one of the PhD students in the lab. And if you're interested, I will also have the reference on the last slide again, where we actually show how those dynamics and heterogeneity influence the spectra of the Lyapunov exponents, and how that results in different memory properties, etc., etc. That's why I'm also kind of, and the closer you get to criticality, the higher the network performance. But then as you pass the critical point, you drop to zero, or the chance level. So there's a trade-off here. And this is for example, the example here in a when we train the networks on a shuffled MNIST task, where you remember that spectrum that was flat, and wherever we place the red line are the intrinsic frequencies of, it's homogeneous networks, the intrinsic frequencies. No, where was this? No, this was, 1 second. No, this was the blue line is exactly. The blue line that's a homogeneous network. And the blue line is for the unshuffled MNIST digits. There you see you get the highest performance when you're at the 2 pi over 28. And then these are the harmonics. So the performance goes down. The most information is in the fundamental frequency. And now the red line is for the same network. But when we shuffle the MNIST digits, where there's no predominant frequency range in which all the information is, you see basically wherever you sit, you get the same level of performance. Now, we also tried training with different noise characteristics. So these are, again, different models. The blue and the orange is usually as the homogeneous and heterogeneous oscillator networks. We add additive white Noisian goes to the training data. You see that here. That's how it looks like. And then we train them. You see that the oscillator networks are kind of not impressed by the noise. Again, you shouldn't wonder given what I told you earlier. But this is LSTM and GRU. LSTM, even if you look, this level of noise basically already makes it fall down to chance level. Because it locks on, it acts like a transistor a bit. It locks on to certain values that it remembers, and then you change the statistics a bit. It doesn't, work really well. And the cool thing is, so those networks can learn on very noisy stimuli. Now we did another test. We trained them on this level of noise, which is insane. And then we change the noise characteristics during inference. And this is how it looks like. And here again, you see heterogeneous networks. When they develop, they learn on noisy data, and they develop stimulus representations that work even better when they remove the noise during the inference. And all of the other models don't even manage to learn anything on this noisy data. That was that. Now let's talk about why does this work. So the networks learn to desynchronize. We looked at pairwise phase locking. These are homogeneous networks. You see, well, they learn to desynchronize, but they only can desynchronize so much because they are driven by the same input and they have no intrinsic noise. But heterogeneous networks are really, really good at desynchronizing. So at the same time, as they desynchronize, of course, the population, this is like the PCA dimensionality of the population vector, that increases. So they increase the dimensionality of their representation. And what you get, they learn to desynchronize and they develop stimulus-specific, temporally dynamic correlation patterns. That's exactly what we see in neural data. So basically, the asynchronous activity is the bedrock for fine-scale dynamic synchronization patterns. So basically, this is before training. That's a homogeneous network, 16 cells. These are all pairwise correlation coefficients here for the entire stimulus period for MNIST. Okay. Initially, you see that's the histogram of the correlation coefficients. They're very synchronous or asynchronous, very highly synchronized state. We see that in natural systems when the systems don't do anything. Sleep, anesthesia, coma. Now, as the network learns, you see they desynchronize. And these, if you look closely, you get stimulus-specific. These are lumped over time, but they are stimulus-specific correlation patterns that emerge. So on the background of this asynchronous activity, you locally and selectively form synchronization patterns that code for information. We also looked at chromoto just as a means to do some higher order things. We looked at the chromoto order parameter that we could resolve over time. And we find, this is an untrained network, that's a trained network, colors indicate classes, that the network performs, and it's a homogeneous network, so you see all the oscillations here, but the network forms class-specific synchronization patterns here, especially during the end where it's forced to do so, because at the dashed line we read out. And so basically, that's what's going on here. Now we looked at heterogeneity, and we find that make the networks more robust by introducing diversity of memory timescales. It alleviates, very important, the need for fine-tuning. A biological system can't do a parameter search. It has to work. So you basically shotgun your frequency space with your detectors, and then you tune the connections so that it kind of fits the statistics or the tasks that you need. So we looked at different types of heterogeneity, scattered natural frequencies and dampening factors, delays in synaptic connections, and modular networks. Now, spoiler, all of those things make increased task performance without increasing the number of trainable parameters. So that lets us conclude that all these features that we see in natural systems are actually not a result of nature's imprecision, but they serve functional tasks, namely increasing the dimensionality of the system and computational power. So here we see this for introducing delays. So that's the, you know, the test accuracy as a function of the maximal delay in the system, both in the first, at the beginning of learning and at the end of learning. So you see that it both increases the speed of learning and the overall performance. And then we look at here at two-layer networks, and that was very interesting. So we give the input to the lower layer. Both layers are independently connected all to all, and they have a certain fraction of feed-forward, feedback connection, and we read out at the top. And the lower layer has some set space frequency and a damping, and then we modulate that in the upper layer by a fixed, by a fixed factor. And then we can search that entire state space. We simulate all the networks, hundreds of networks, and then we look at the performance. And what do we find? Now, very interestingly, you see this dip here. When we put those networks, and this is a factor on the omega, on the frequency, when we put them in the same frequency band, it doesn't work that well. So that means this is probably not a good idea. If you do two-layer, probably they should be separated. And the best performance is where, at least, you know, in the things that we tested here, the highest performance we could observe when the upper layer is roughly half the frequency of the lower layer, so that the lower layer performs high frequency and high frequency space, so to say, computations locally, and then transmits that information to the upper layer, which is much slower. That kind of makes the the more abstract computations. And then, though, this is interesting, the feedback connections from the upper layer allow those slower units, because remember, our gain curve is asymmetric, so less can permeate from bottom to up than from up to bottom. And so those things can do basically a forcing. And so we see, long story short, is that this again increases the performance at the same number of parameters. So this is a one-layer network. Here is the orange one, and all of these other colors here are two-layer networks with less trainable parameters. Becomes more efficient. And then we also looked at something else, namely, if you look at the weights, again, those are trained with backpropagation, okay? But then we looked at the weights. We looked at the weights of, if you here, I'm showing you a scatter plot of the pairwise coefficients, correlation coefficients of nodal dynamics, and here versus their connection weights. That's in the untrained network. In a homogeneous network, you see they're either synchronized or not, and there's no structure in the weights. They're unspecific and broadband and basically close to uniform. Now, this is after a couple of hundred of training steps. First of all, you see, oh, yeah, the network learned to desynchronize. Yes, that's good. At the same time, the weights, Gaussian, if you look at them, well, maybe also not so interesting by itself. But now you look at the you look at scatter plot. What you see is, oh, there is a tendency for nodes, when they're anti-correlated, to have stronger negative weights, and when they're correlated, to have more positive weights. This is exactly what is predicted by a Hebbian learning principle. Here we don't have structural plasticity. The connections are always all to all, right? But and in natural systems this is different. But this is actually what the Hebbian rule would predict. So we said, okay, that's interesting. Let's try to come up with a Hebbian rule, just an additive update that's active, here on the recurrent connections, et cetera, I've done these rules in the past, so, it was kind of knowing what I could do. And then I did it. And the green here is the system trained with backpropagation. And this one is the unsupervised learning rule. It doesn't always work that well, I have to tell you. But I was very surprised that these systems seem to be ideally suited for these unsupervised rules. We here we still train the readout layer with backpropagation and also the input layer, but something happens here. And actually, this was not the positive Hebbian rule, but a negative. And that actually can be explained. We probably can discuss this, is because here the network's already very synchronous. And in the brain, you actually have those two rules active at the same time. So when you're synchronous, you want to separate. And when you're getting too separated, you want to become synchronous again. So you have basically like to try to find an equilibrium here. We also simulated the network. So far, everything was time series. Okay, we serialize, as I described, the endless digits. Here, we now said, okay, let's look at spatially organized inputs. So we have a network where each cell node codes for a 2x2 pixel. And this gives you a 14x14 network here. And we flash the stimulus onto the network. This is how it looks like. You see it to the right here. You flash. You see almost nothing because those things go on the amplitude. So the system needs some time to swing itself into the thing, into the state. And then we read out here after some time. And this is, by the way, highly reminiscent of what we see in natural systems too. When you flash a stimulus, you see nothing. And then you wait for a couple hundred milliseconds. All of a sudden, you see all the activity. So now we trained those networks again with backpropagation, 10 class, usual story here. And what we find is very interesting. The networks develop local connectivity as a result. Initially, they're unspecific all-to-all. After training, you get a Mexican hat kind of thing. And when you shuffle the digits, you train with this, the performance is the same. But these are the weight distributions. So we actually think that potentially, the local connectivity that we see in natural systems is probably also resultant from the signal statistics that we have in our natural environment. Because those, it's well known, right, that if you look at luminance correlations, they quickly decay in natural images. And it's a very stable, so to say, finding. And also what's very interesting, we find traveling waves in those systems that naturally emerge. Left are the amplitudes, right is the phases. You here see that the neurons, of course, that get the same stimulus, they phase lock. And we get traveling waves both in phase space and in amplitude space here. And if you look closely, you will actually see how different digits result in different wave patterns already visually, that you can visually look at. For example, a 1 gives a spiral thing. That's a 0 that we just saw. That's a different that results in kind of some top-down motion. Now this is a 4. So it has a different, we get something that go bottom up, left, right, etc. So those traveling waves are indicative, and we never told the system anything, right? So this was just an observation. There's a whole thing, whole universe behind that. We also started working now. We said, okay, that's interesting. So we started implementing this in analog electrical hardware. So it's easy, right? You can build those oscillator circuits. This is with a company based in Frankfurt. They build hybrid digital analog computers, meaning they're programmable analog computers. All the computations are analog, but they have an interface to a digital computer that allows us to program the system. And these are some first results that you see here. We now have a working prototype, which is very small, 4 oscillators only, but it can solve MNIST to over 70% accuracy with 12 trainable parameters. This is done here by Pedro. So here you see certain traces of both, our models, and so this digital prediction, and then how it turns out in the actual thing. And this is the confusion matrix here for the 10 digits. So you see it doesn't really get all the digits right. There's a subclass here that where it's particularly good at, it can really do the 1 here, and it finds the 7 and a 6 and also a 3, but the other ones are a bit worse. Anyways, so this led us to this whole other things of like computing with wave patterns. We're of course not the first ones that look at this, but this is kind of currently ongoing research, and also analog and physics-based computing. So of course we're looking, and this is also why I'm here. We think, can we take that to the laser implementation also? And believe it or not, there are relationships to quantum computing also, namely that the wave-based analog computation also allow for superposition principle. They don't allow for entanglement, which is quantum world, right? But already the superposition principle is incredibly powerful and allows us to, even now, you all know Ising machines, I assume, we can solve certain things that are attributed normally to quantum computers, but those things are attractor models. The models we discuss here are, they work with transient states, and this is something we're also working on, is computing with a sequence of metastable states. And so in summary, this is a biology-inspired RNN of oscillates, a network of networks with high learning speed, task performance, noise resiliency. The units have priors and do a nonlinear gain modulation through resonance. The units code in frequency space exploit the phenomena available in oscillators. They code thereby dynamically, not just with converging weight distributions like in feed-forward models. They learn to desynchronize. The learning is compatible with Hebbian principles. The heterogeneity makes the networks flexible and alleviates parameter search and tuning. And there are many, many parallels to biological systems. And for me personally, it's a novel view on recurrent dynamics. So you have to think about those networks as a nonlinear anisotropic medium of nodes that act a bit like antennas that have wave-based representations, both in the single node and in the network. The nodes use frequency bands for coding and frequency-dependent gain modulation and resonance. Any input is turned to a wave pattern. So it's like a wave machine. The network's dynamics are rich, non-stationary, and they use interference patterns for computation. The networks desynchronize when processing input. This is also very reminiscent of biological systems where we see this, and this enables only the desynchronization. It's very, very important, because if you don't desynchronize, you can't code information by synchrony. So desynchronize and then code information by fine scale synchrony. And that was exactly what was predicted by Singer and his binding by synchrony hypothesis many decades ago already. And the networks can use amplitude, frequency, and phase modulation for information processing. The networks are gradient stable. That's why we can train them with backpropagation. And the oscillating activity serves as an inductive bias. This is a new, so to say, computational principle. And a result, we get holistic representation of information. Information spreads over the network. Everything is everywhere to some degree. It allows distance units to communicate over relays. Very importantly, the brain needs to do that. The lower the frequency, the easier. That's, again, in agreement what we see from neuroscience. And the observations are all very compatible with physiological findings. And this is where I want to finally stop. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Felix. Questions? Leo?
Thanks for this very dense talk. Can you please go back to the waves that you were illustrating? Just one quick question there. So yeah, is this for the homogeneous or for the heterogeneous case?
This is a homogeneous network, because here it was not clear. When we do heterogeneous networks here, then certain geometrical positions would display, so to say, would extract different information than others. So this one is a homogeneous network here.
So you are also talking about oscillations. So whether or not a system can be functional without oscillations.
Yeah.
So my question here is in a similar way. Can you get dynamics without traveling waves or without waves in general, or the waves are always there?
I think the waves are always there because, look, if you have a homogeneous network with local connectivity, you can actually interpret this as a discretization of a 2D wave equation. So you almost get some, I have to be careful because I'm sitting for a room here full of physicists. It's almost a wave-particle duality where, your wave equation as a two-dimensional PDE is continuous in space and time. And when you look at the lattice of damped harmonic oscillators, you basically discretize that in space. And there really is a mathematical equivalence. Now you also discretize time. Okay, you have a fully discretized system. But so this is why there will always be waves when you do those oscillators.
And what about in the heterogeneous case? Do you always get waves as well?
Yes, but these are waves in a very complicated medium that locally has all different kinds of absorption and scattering, so to say, phenomena, right? So and all of a sudden, you know, the thing is taken to a different frequency, etc. So it becomes much more complicated. But it's not. This is where I'm actually not sure whether this duality that I described still holds, and I don't think so. It's more general. But any oscillator, when given any input, at least locally, you always have the wave. It will like to do the wave if it's not forced externally to do something else.
I have a question. When you replace or when you study the case of the Hebb rule, you are not using back propagation through time in that case. You only train the system via the Hebb.
No. So this is, it warrants a bit more explanation. There are input connections and there are readout connections. Those two are always trained with backpropagation. But for the case of the Hebb network, we do not give backpropagation access to the recurrent connections, and we freeze them, so to say, backprop cannot access them, and we change them actively by our learning rule. And we compare as a base, this is the base case here, where the backpropagation, we call it the reservoir case, where backpropagation can only train the input and the output, and the the recurrent connections are fixed and random. This is that orange line here. So you get to, it shows you how relatively good the reservoir already is with the random weights. You get to like whatever 20% something classification accuracy if you only optimize the readout and the and now, and the green one is the full, where backpropagation can also change the recurrent weight. So you see, oh, that gives you a big boost. And this one is backpropagation changes the input and the output, and the recurrent connections are Hebbian.
Okay, good. Yeah, Tobias.
This is more of a meta question, not specific to this talk. Well, you said at the beginning that you look at the brain or natural computing sort of and say, well, can we do something like this, right? You gave efficiency rules, but why should one do that? So for example, Steve Jobs has this example of transportation on Earth, right? And apparently humans are very inefficient compared to other animals in terms of transporting 1 kilo, 1 meter, whatever. And then what humans do is invent the wheel, and the bicycle is apparently incredibly efficient. When we build airplanes, we don't try to do anything like what birds do, right? So why should we here do that?
That's a very good, I like that a lot, because I also use that analogy between birds and planes. Okay, so our planes are clearly not like birds. At the same time, they're very useful to us. They took me here. Okay, so otherwise I wouldn't be here. But they cause all the problems, that we see in the world with energy expenditure and pollution, etc., etc. And I think then that's neuroscientists in me. I would still like to understand why the bird can fly, although I already have the plane. So, and this is how I see transformers in a way, like they're the planes of maybe machine learning right now, at least until the next model comes along. Okay, so they do incredibly useful things, but they are not, so to say, they're not really imitating nature. And on the other hand, what you see with those exploding energy costs and expenditures for those, AI models or large language models, that is for me also a motivation to start looking into that, because those things can be incredibly energy efficient. And even if not, even if we don't, for me, this excursion of trying to understand what natural systems do is worthwhile, so to say, all the effort.
Any other question? Well, if not, thanks again.
Thank you.